that he was actively using when he filled out that form or during the 11 days he had that gun. And his attorney, Abbe Lowell, who is a longtime criminal defense attorney in Washington, he's a very well-known Washington scandal lawyer, is doing all he can to inject doubt into this very, as prosecutors present it, open and shut case of Hunter Biden's addiction. So, for instance, Lowell tries to poke holes in the prosecution's argument that Hunter Biden would frequent a particular 7-Eleven in Delaware to buy drugs by saying there's no absolute proof through text messages, through location data, or otherwise that Hunter was actually in that 7-Eleven buying drugs. At one point, Lowell says, you don't know if he's just there to buy a cup of coffee. And that is the work of a defense attorney to say, unless there is hard evidence showing him with a dealer, it could have been for any other reason than to buy drugs. And Hunter Biden could have been or believed himself to be sober.
I'm curious who the defense called to the witness stand in their effort to try to muddy this picture of Hunter Biden as someone addicted to drugs in this period.
So the defense actually most notably called Hunter Biden's eldest daughter, Naomi Biden, to the stand. And they try to use Naomi as a witness who understands that her father was, by her own words, hopeful and the best she'd seen him in a long time during this period of time. But upon cross-examination, prosecutors pull out text messages between Naomi Biden and her father that show a different story. During the time Hunter Biden had this gun, Naomi Biden is trying to meet up with him in New York City and is unable to reach him. And at one point, she tells her father she's really sad. She can't handle this. She just misses him and wants to hang out with him. And prosecutors use those communications to establish that, in fact, this was actually not great. His own daughter could not reach him when they were in the same city.
So the defense's theoretically best witness to this idea that he was not a drug addict at this time, that he might have even been sober or on his way to being sober, ends up being someone who essentially confirms the prosecution's claims that Hunter Biden is still not okay during this period.
Right. So by the time Naomi Biden leaves the stand, walks across the room, and wraps her dad in a hug for about a minute, it becomes clear that this testimony and this cross-examination especially did not go the way Hunter Biden and his team hoped it would have.
And of course, we know that this defense strategy didn't work because we now know the guilty verdict. It seems clear that this jury ultimately looks at all this evidence and says that while perhaps they didn't have a time-stamped photograph of Hunter Biden, using drugs or being high on drugs the day that he bought this gun, it very much seems from the testimony that the jury believed the prosecution's portrayal of him as someone very much in the throes of drug addiction at the time that he bought that gun.
Right. And in the end, jurors took only 3 hours to return a guilty verdict.
Right. So let's turn to the reaction to this verdict, starting with Hunter Biden's father, President Joe Biden.
Right. So minutes after the verdict is announced and the First Lady walks out of the courthouse holding Hunter Biden's hand, the president releases a statement reiterating his support for his son, how proud he is of what he called seeing someone you love come out of the other side of an addiction like this. But also, he says he is going to accept the outcome of the trial. Last week, he was asked if he would pardon Hunter Biden, and President Biden said no. So to me, that's drawing a clear line of being a supportive father who backs his son no matter what, and a president who is not going to overreach and pardon someone who was just convicted in a court of law.
Right, and that simultaneously seemed to be President Biden drawing a contrast with former President Trump.
Right. So in an election that has been all about drawing a character contrast with Donald Trump, the statement itself strikes a contrast with Donald Trump, who has railed against the outcome of his own trial, has essentially lashed out at every aspect of this legal process. President Biden, by contrast, has quietly accepted the outcome and continued to say that he will keep embracing his son.
Since you raised it, the question of this conviction and the election, I think, is going to be on many people's minds. How does the conviction of the incumbent president's son on gun charges potentially impact the course of this election?
Well, at the very least, a conviction of the president's son shows that there were consequences in a legal trial that had some serious weight to them. All along, Republicans have alleged that, the Biden-led Justice Department was going to let the president's son off easy. So the fact that Hunter Biden was convicted takes some of the steam out of the Republican argument that he would get some sort of sweetheart deal or be treated more favorably than Donald Trump would have been during his own hush money trial. That said, Republicans will use this, and Donald Trump will use this to bolster this idea that the Bidens are a crime family, that corruption runs through the family. And in fact, Hunter Biden is going to stand trial later this summer on tax evasion charges. And Republicans are certainly hoping to, in the heat of a campaign season, attack the Bidens again on the grounds that the Bidens can't be trusted, essentially. I would expect to hear more of that in a drumbeat as this campaign goes on.
Katie, I'm curious, in a country that's ravaged by a drug epidemic, is it possible that this conviction and watching Joe Biden reach out to his son and this family go through what it's gone through might not just be something that doesn't hurt Biden, and this admittedly gets kind of complicated and cynical when it comes to politics, but potentially makes Biden more relatable to some voters, and in some sense is a political virtue?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and Americans have showed in polls that what they see of Joe Biden is a father supporting his son. And that's not a political calculation on Joe Biden's part. I think if you know anything about the president and his relationship with his kids, it was forged out of great tragedy at the beginning of President Biden's career. And they're extremely close because of that. And they're incredibly loyal to each other because of that. And you just see that play out through the presidency. You're seeing it play out today. The president rearranged his schedule really quickly after the verdict to go fly home to Wilmington to see his son, met Hunter Biden on the tarmac and gave him a hug. So there is that cynical part of you that thinks this is a play for sympathy or a play for Americans to see this family in a different way. But also, several of those jurors had family members who suffer from addiction. Most Americans know somebody or are related to someone who suffers from this. It's an incredibly universal problem that Americans deal with. And for the president of the United States to be dealing with the fallout of that is relatable.
Katie, I think it makes sense to end this conversation where we began, which is grappling with the fact of these two criminal convictions, not just of Hunter Biden, but of Hunter Biden and Donald Trump. When Hunter Biden was convicted, it struck me, at least, that if we're being really honest with ourselves, both Donald Trump and Hunter Biden would probably never have been put on trial for these particular charges, a gun charge, in the case of Hunter Biden, a hush money payment, in the case of Donald Trump, had they not been president or been the president's son, right? That just feels like an objective reality. Trump came into the crosshairs of a Democratic district attorney. Hunter Biden came into the crosshairs of a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney.
Right.
And so what does all of this say about the way that our legal system is now interacting with our political system?
Well, essentially, we've entered an era where politicians are trying to use the legal system to their benefit and where the courts are going to feel more pressure to carry out their wishes. And, to be clear, that doesn't mean all of these cases are without merit or are going to be without merit, but they're now going to be carried out in this environment where politics at the very least will be the backdrop or at the most will be a major factor. So to me, it's looking a bit like it's the price of admission to presidential politics. And as we're seeing with future cases against Hunter Biden and Donald Trump, this is clearly a phenomenon Americans are going to have to keep grappling with.
Right, their politicians and even their politicians' children on trial.
Exactly.
Well, Katie, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Hunter Biden is likely to be sentenced in the next few months. He faces up to 25 years in prison, but because he is a first-time non-violent offender, the judge in the case may choose a more lenient punishment. We'll be right back.
This podcast is supported by State Street Global Advisors. Electricity, a big idea that's inspired countless new ones. From powering the light bulb to virtually powering our entire lives. 30 years ago, State Street launched the SPDR S&P 500 ETF, SPY. A big idea that inspired the world to invest differently, and still does. What can you do with SPY?
Before investing, consider the fund's investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Visit ssga.com for a prospectus containing this and other information. Read it carefully before investing. SPY is subject to risks similar to those of stocks. All ETFs are subject to risk, including possible loss of principal. Alps Distributors, Inc. Distributor.
Here's what else you need to know today. In secret recordings made last week, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito told a woman posing as a conservative Catholic that compromise in America between the left and the right might be impossible.
One side or the other is going to win, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. It's not like we're going to split the difference.
At another point, Alito told the woman, who in real life is a liberal activist, that he agreed with her claim that the United States must return to a place of godliness.
People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
The unguarded remarks made at an annual dinner attended by Supreme Court justices reinforces Alito's reputation as a committed social conservative, intent on safeguarding the place of Christianity in American life, and they are likely to intensify questions about Alito's impartiality. Alito is already under fire for allowing 2 flags associated with the January 6th riots at the U.S. Capitol to fly over his homes at various times following the 2020 election. Today's episode was produced by Shannon Lin, Stella Tan, and Will Weed. It was edited by Devin Taylor, contains original music by Dan Powell, Marian Lozano, and Alicia Baitu, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley. Our theme music is by Jim Brunberg and Ben Lansberg of Wonderly.